Today I would like to talk to you about helping students in poverty take flight in literacy. First of all, what is poverty? Poverty is an economic condition in which people lack sufficient income to obtain certain minimal levels of health services, food, housing, clothing, and education generally recognized as necessary to ensure an adequate standard of living. Let's look at the map here on our right. This map shows the state of Georgia, and as you can see, a large amount of the state of Georgia is greatly impacted by poverty. Now, the darker the region, the more poverty. And you can see that a lot of the poverty is central in the middle Georgia area to south Georgia area, especially over here in the southwestern area of Georgia. Now, also, let's look at this statistics here on our left. The child poverty rate in Georgia is at 27%. Women in poverty, a little over 20%. But the amount of students and children of single-parent families that are below poverty jumps to 40%. And the number of Black and Hispanic children below 200% poverty is at 776,000. These statistics were very startling to me because of the demographics of my school. 46% of our students are Black, 46% are Hispanic, a large number are single-parent families. That explains a lot about why we are at 98% of our students at free and reduced lunch, and why a lot of our students may struggle with literacy. So let's look at poverty's impact on education historically. Attention first came in the 1980s when The Nation at Risk was released. And research has narrowed down 6 primary manifestations that impact children of poverty. Their families and parenting behaviors, their parent employment, food insecurity, exposure to toxins, health insurance, and early childhood care. I want to call attention to 3 areas that I think have the greatest impact on children's literacy. Their families and parenting behaviors. Over 85% of children in poverty live in single-parent homes, and only around 40% of children below the poverty line have parents that read to them daily. This may be in part to their parents' employment. A lot of parents in poverty have unstable or part-time employment. In Georgia, 35% of families with children are impacted by this, which is higher than the U.S. average. The final area that I feel like is of great importance to understanding poverty's impact on education is early childhood care. More children in poverty do not receive regular child care prior to coming to school, or those that do receive low quality care, which leaves them with very low school readiness. Now, when we talk about poverty, we also have to think about the types of poverty. As Eric Jensen identified in his book, Teaching with Poverty in Mind, there are some different types of poverty. First is situational, then there's generational, absolute, relative, urban, and rural. For the students of my school in particular, I could identify 2 primary types of poverty that I see in my students. A lot of my students, I see generational poverty. That means that 2 or more generations have been born into poverty. Not only are these children in poverty, their parents grew up in poverty and their grandparents grew up in poverty. And for many of these families, they do not have the skills necessary to move from their situation. So living in poverty is something that is just something they're used to, and they're not sure how to even get out of it. Another type of poverty that I see impacting my students is the rural poverty. Now, rural poverty happens, there's a larger percent of students in rural poverty than in urban settings. This occurs in populations below 50,000, and typically you see more single guardian families, and they have less access to support for disabilities and quality education. Unlike urban poverty, students in rural poverty do not have access to some of the same after-school opportunities because of the fact that it is a rural area and there's just not as many resources available. Now, let's look at the characteristics of these learners. In Jensen's book, he identified an acronym, EACH, to help you remember the characteristics of these learners. They have emotional and social challenges. They have acute and chronic stressors. They have cognitive lags, and they have health and safety issues. Many of their emotional and social challenges deal with the fact that they are often left to fend for themselves, and they have less participation in enriching summer and after-school activities or opportunities. And the fact that some of their socioeconomic status can impact how teachers view them, and which is very disappointing because these students have the capability of growing and learning just like anybody else. As for their acute and chronic stressors, there's more movement between schools due to the low-income housing market. There's higher rates of depression, which can lead to disengaged parenting, and more cases of abuse are reported in families of poverty. There's also cognitive lags. Poverty impacts IQ, achievement test, and literacy. Home environments have limited access to rich language experiences, which leads to low vocabulary, and they have less access to high-quality preschool experiences. And then for health and safety issues, their low birth rates cause more babies being born premature or having disabilities, and their lower immune systems lead to more absences from schools. When their needs aren't met, and again, I broke it down based off of Jensen's acronym each, when their emotional and social needs are not met. This sometimes can lead to their inability to work in groups because they're not sure how to work in groups. They haven't been taught how to work in groups, which then causes an increase in acting out behaviors, impatience, and inappropriate emotional responses. When their stressors are not addressed, there may be a reduction in their ability to remember or to recall information. There's less motivation, perseverance, and effort. And there's actually a decrease in growth of new brain cells when these stressors are in play. When their cognitive lags aren't met, gaps in educational achievement occur, and the poor academic performance often leads to diminished expectations, which then provides them with a low self-esteem. When their health issues are not addressed, there's higher rates of undiagnosed or untreated disabilities or problems that can happen, and longer absences from school occur. So what can we do to help them? Several classroom interventions have been put into play. One of the interventions I found was for phonemic awareness. And low-income students are particularly at risk for later reading difficulties because they didn't have the access to print that a lot of their higher income peers had. So this intervention focused on providing phonemic awareness interventions for children in pre-K. When these interventions were used in preschool at the earliest time possible in school to address the phonemic needs of low-income students, an increase in readiness was noted in end-of-year pre-K testing, and that readiness was sustained in kindergarten. So this means that even though our students from poverty come with lower literacy skills, if we can get to them earlier, their ability to grow and to be able to make some gains is possible. Similar findings were also found with vocabulary interventions. Now, Newman and Wright identified 5 principles that are needed to enhance vocabulary development for students, especially students of poverty. The first is that they have both explicit and implicit instruction. They have an intentional word selection by teachers, the building of word meanings through cluster teaching, repeated exposure to gain vocabulary, and ongoing professional development for their teachers. Now, Newman and Wright put these practices into play, and when they did, they had several control groups. Some that were from higher performing peers in a university daycare setting or university school setting, or ones that were in state mandated preschools, maybe like a Head Start program. And then their treatment group is where they compared them. So if these interventions are used, a significant difference in gains for the treatment groups was noted, even compared to control groups of higher income students. The connections to words was more apparent, and extended learning occurred more frequently in the control groups. I think a lot of this goes back to the building of word meanings through cluster teaching. This means that you're not teaching words in isolation, but you're helping children see how these words and this vocabulary can be connected across areas, or how words are connected to each other. One of the examples it gave was, like, for example, the word row, R-O-W, and the word or, O-A-R. This meant that if you knew the word or, you might know the word row, which then might mean that you could understand the word boating, and that these words all went together when you saw them. Another intervention that I found extremely interesting was the family literacy interventions, because, like it was identified before, a lot of these students have low parent involvement, or their parents aren't sure what to do, their parents haven't been equipped with how to help their students. So family literacy interventions, so this means that the sustained and increasing parental involvement over the years of children's elementary schooling has been shown to correlate with higher levels of reading achievement. So teaching parents how to support their child's literacy development and setting their beliefs on a parent's role in learning to read will help promote homeschool partnerships. So with this intervention, parents were invited to come and be a part of some classes to learn how to better interact with their students when it came to literacy. And what it found was the parents who received help with reading strategies not only were able to help their children increase their reading abilities, but they also increased their frequency in which they were reading with their child every night, which then, again, helped their child increase their overall reading ability. 3 things really stuck out to me as I was researching this, and one of them is the fact that a large number of poverty-stricken areas are grouped into neighborhoods, which are also known as school attendance boundaries. So many students in poverty attend schools with other students affected by poverty. There's no one there to really help pull them out, except for their teachers. And so our job as a teacher, especially if you work in a school with high poverty, is to really provide those examples of how to move forward, not only for the students, but also for the parents, and to provide those parents and those children with what they need to move on from poverty. Low-income students also perform significantly lower on standardized tests, so the achievement gap between Black and white students, more so than the achievement gap between Black and white students. What this means is poverty is an equalizer among students. When racial demographics were taken away, low-income students perform relatively the same. So looking at race as a factor is not nearly as significant as the impact poverty actually can play in a student's success. The third area that really stuck out to me as I was researching was that helping students close the achievement gap is not unattainable. These interventions I talked about, they all happen in early grades, pre-K through kindergarten, or pre-K through second grade. So if we can provide interventions for these students early on, we're going to be more likely to be able to help them overcome those achievement gaps in literacy as before they get into the upper grades. Here are my references, and thank you for listening.